Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben. And welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. Pleasure and honor. Actually, this is my third time talking at this specific venue, the NIH Project Management Community meeting. So for those of you who are remote, you should be seeing my slides. And right now, the particular topic of this presentation is 9 things exceptional project leaders do differently. I want to give a special thanks to Debbie for reaching out to me and inviting me to be here today. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I'm actually nearby because my office is right up the street in Rockville. And also to Podcast Village, because I'm actually recording this separate, the audio, and produce this in partnership with Podcast Village to actually provide a podcast of my entire talk, and I'll make that available to everybody who's attending. I'll put this on the same landing page where we place the video for today's discussion. If you're on Twitter, use #ProjectLeadership as if you want to share, you're welcome to take pictures of my slides or share with your followers and include my company's handle, which is @BoldPMG. Also, for those of you who are remote, and even for those of you who are here, if you guys have 2 different ways that you can actually grab a couple of free ebooks that kind of go along with the topic of today's discussion. And you can actually either connect with me directly on LinkedIn. The first URL is my LinkedIn profile. You can send me a connect invite. I'll reply with the information as to where you can grab your copies of the ebook. Or you can go directly and check into this page, the bit.ly NIH PMC talk, submit your information, and you'll get an email notification automatically letting you know where you can download the 2 books, and also will guide you to the landing page where this entire slide deck is already posted, and we're going to be sharing those, not just the slides, but also the video and the podcast out of this talk. And of course, the video and podcast will be available after the session because they take a little bit of production before we put them on the same landing page. So if you want to follow along, you can actually check in. You're going to get the link where the entire slide deck is already posted. It's a landing page, and you can actually just go slide by slide, and we can actually move forward. So let's start with this topic. This entire topic is focused on really understanding, answering this particular question. Why are some project managers better than others achieving exceptional results? And why do these people become sort of like the stars of project management? They kind of start at the entry level, and they move on to project management level, to senior project manager level. All of a sudden, they're actually managing teams of project managers. What makes them so special? We're going to specifically focus on 9 things that exceptional project leaders, regardless of which organization they work in, what are the things that they do to actually start driving not just themselves to lead, but also create followers, so to speak. And the followers that are other project managers who basically will really learn a lot about what they're doing because they're really great at, no matter what team they're given, they assess the strengths and weaknesses, and then they figure out very quickly how do they start delegating work to the right people at the right time. And I can't talk about management without actually quoting Peter Drucker. And the quote is, management is doing things right. That really is what management is all about. Leadership, however, is about doing the right things. And project leaders understand that being exceptional means that you have to do a balance of both. Being able to drive the direction of your project and manage the quality of your project, that means delivering on time, on budget, as scoped. Leadership is about ensuring that you have the right people on the team, you're working on the right tasks, and even if your tasks are varying on a daily basis, how do you hand off when sometimes you realize multitasking is not necessarily the best approach for your team? You need to make sure that you have ownership, and sometimes it's really not a marathon, it's a relay race, because one person will take take it as far as they can, hand it off to the next person, that person will hand off to the next person, and so on and so forth. And eventually, the team gets there faster than somebody trying to do it all at the same time. So we're going to focus on leadership and those things that actually start enabling each of you to become much better leaders. And the first thing is to focus on understanding what is project success. Beyond the things that you learn from if you are PMP certified and realize that there's a triple constraint for any project and that you can manage any project as a temporary endeavor, and now you're basically starting to start with a team and then from there figure out how to ramp up once you go beyond initiation of a project. Success entails going across all the phases of any project, from beginning all the way to end. And realize that sometimes the ending is not necessarily what you agreed upon at the very beginning when you first initiated the project. Expect things to go wrong and expect that sometimes other things will take higher priority than others, and that as a whole, the organization needs to have clarity as to the placement of one project versus another when there's multiple projects that are all part of the same portfolio of projects. And that sometimes those are decisions that need to be made that are not about individual quality of deliverables for a specific project. It has to do with the entire placement as to where your project lies in priority with respect to the rest of the portfolio of projects that you have within your organization. And you need to have clarity from the very beginning from your team. Because sometimes, not always are you going to be on the #1 project for your organization. As a matter of fact, if I ask you a question, if you're just starting out, let's say as a project manager, you're in an assistant role, or maybe you have a couple of years as a project manager within an organization, are you given a very critical project for the organization, or are you given lower priority projects, right? There's kind of like a series of steps as to how you start out in project management, because as starting a newly minted project manager, you're not going to be necessarily assigned to a very critical project. As a matter of fact, you're going to be assigned to maybe very short projects, a very small team, and not very much budget. But over time, as you start proving that you can deliver on those, you're going to get more and more responsibilities. That was the track record that I had. I actually worked in R&D for over 10 years, working for NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and I'm an engineer by trade. So I started taking care of technical tasks, proved that I could actually not just do my tasks, but also help others out in making sure that we would get everything done, because my specialty was hardware. We needed to have a product, and that product entailed hardware, firmware, software, and they all needed to work together in order to have a solution. Well, if my focus was hardware and that's all I did, often when I was already done, I would get involved in making sure that the firmware people knew exactly what the hardware was capable of doing. And vice versa, the software people needed to know the visibility as to what were the functionality, the capabilities, how do you access the functionality on the hardware or the firmware that hands off the information so that you can actually process the right information at the right time. That's project success. So starting with number one of the 9 things that make project leaders exceptional people and exceptional leaders is, number 1, you've got to start by setting the right direction for the entire team and understand what is the purpose of your project and what is its placement with respect to the rest of the projects within the organization. And a couple of those things, you have to not only figure out how to create your objectives to become smart, you want to make sure that the entire team puts together objectives, goals that are smarter, where the last piece, the E and the R, are about figuring out how often should you be evaluating where you're at, where you started, where you're at, progress, report the results, and based on changing priorities, not necessarily within your project, but other projects that also need the same resources that you're relying upon, how to readjust accordingly. And realize that sometimes the readjustment, there's nothing you can control, because you may be doing well in your project, but somebody else may be getting behind, and you need to figure out how to get them caught up, or vice versa. And sometimes that readjustment means that you have to communicate not just within your own team, but also with other project managers who own other related projects that you're working on. And the ER piece is the piece that leadership really steps in, because it's not about just managing and making sure that you're keeping track of your project. It's about communicating laterally and upward, as well as with your team, to make sure that you know exactly when and how to readjust when needed. Because sometimes those calls are not about the status of your project. Your project may be completely green the entire time, and now you need to shift your resources because there's other projects that are in red that have a higher priority. And part of that is that you need to implement best practices. The more of this that you do, the better, because you start not only relying upon one person, but that one person can actually start training, mentoring others, and coaching others on building knowledge, on making sure they start with the right processes or the right tools, and that they identify the skills as well as the ethics that kind of creates the culture within the organization that allows you to realize and actually get further ahead together as a team rather than individuals working on their own. Number two, you got to keep teams engaged. Well, how do you keep teams engaged when, if you look at literature out there, they're saying that in today's workforce, where more and more of us are having to do a lot of 1099 basis type of work, we know that we're gainfully employed today, but we don't know what's going to happen whenever our contract is going to end, because there's no guarantees. So what happens as a result? Well, plenty of literature out there, studies across industries in organizations where the majority of the people in the organizations are unengaged. And so motivating them, inspiring them, is really hard, because all they want to do is just show up and get paid, for the most part, and basically do their time, so to speak, until the next project starts. So how do you start dealing with those type of situations? And this is where you start, as a project leader, you start thinking more like a general manager when you're in charge of a sports team, like a basketball team. And understand that sometimes, yes, you have the talent, and you have that the current team has strengths and weaknesses, and not only are you figuring out how to optimize the performance of the team for the current season, you're already thinking about next season. Who do you need to draft on board? Because you're seeing deficiencies, and maybe you have some injuries and things that you didn't expect that happened, and now you need to figure out how to fill in the gap. A general manager's responsibility in any team sport is to figure out, where do you go out and scout, and where do you out and look for talent, because you realize that the team has certain strengths and certain weaknesses, and you need to figure out how to leverage those strengths and minimize those weaknesses by bringing the right talent at the right time to fill in as needed. And maybe they're not necessarily full-time on the project. They're going to be coming in on demand, so to speak, but you need to at least figure out how to vet those people, that talent, so that they can become available at the right time and they can be turned on when you need them. Cultivate the right work environment. And this means that you need to at least align and make sure that at least everybody fits within the organization's culture. Any organization has a specific culture. And culture is sort of invisible for many of us that have been there for years, because it tends to become transparent, invisible, after a few years of being here. So how do you go about identifying the culture within your organization if you're not savvy enough to do that? Well, typically, who are the ones that pinpoint things that happen around here, because that's the way things are done around here? It's the new people coming on board, right? So if you are continuously networking with people that are brand new to the organization and get their feedback about how they're feeling, how comfortable, what are the things they like, what are the things they don't like, what are the things that they believe need to be improved with the organization to actually make it much more appealing to them, like millennials, so to speak. This is where you start looking at where are the gaps of your culture, and realize that the culture that you have today may have been sort of like inherited, not necessarily the best way to move forward for what's happening in the next what needs to happen in the next 5, 10 years, And that means that somehow the culture needs to change. And often, then those may be barriers, roadblocks that are invisible to everybody else who's been with the organization for a while. It impacts all the new employees. And sometimes you have a hard time engaging them. And often you need to figure out how to undo this and bring in the specialists who can help you ensure that you have the right culture for the next generation of workers that are going to help you realize what you need to realize as an organization. Project leaders realize that it's all about understanding the shared values of the team in order to actually start creating that team environment, and that individuals feel that they're not just contributing individually, but they're actually working together, and that together they realize a lot more work because it's a multiplier effect, not just an additive effect. In other words, when the team is made up of N members, it's not 1 + 1 + 1 until you get to N. It's 1 times N work productivity that you can get when you engage your team. And often, once you start working on those things and start getting people really engaged, you now start realizing, okay, well, what are those things that we need to improve? And what are the things that are sort of like unseen that are barriers, cultural barriers, or maybe even procedural hurdles, regulatory compliance issues that you need to deal with that may be preventing you from getting to where you need to be quicker. And overcoming hurdles is really about understanding what are the compliance issues, what are the social, political, or socioeconomic issues that you need to understand based on who your customers are. And ensure that within the team internal, you're eliminating any kind of communication silos, because communication silos are the biggest barriers to, culture, to exchanges, to being able to really get a team together and inspire your workers to work together. So communication is key, right? And this is where your communication plans, when you have a project, is key. How are you going to communicate to not just internal to your stakeholders that are part of the team, but also upward, sideways as well to peers, as well as to your sponsors? Because those are all different stakeholders that are part of the project, and you have to have transparency. Today, in today's environment specifically, why is Zuckerberg right now in front of Congress or Facebook, right? Transparency is key. And the fact that they were not too transparent about, what's going on as the way they advertise, now they're actually, in front of Congress figuring out what is going on and what wasn't, as transparent as they should have been. And sometimes lack of transparency is a barrier to engaging people and getting things done. Also, overcoming hurdles, you realize that some hurdles are going to be there a little bit longer than you would like, and sometimes you just need to get your team to be on board that they need to be patient. And the fact is that you can't just saw, immediately what you harvest, right? It takes time for things to really get traction, no matter what the project is at hand. And persevering is really about ensuring the team has the right expectations about the level of patience they need to have in dealing with certain situations, dealing with certain people that may be difficult to deal with, and then figuring out, how to get along and persevere, and even figuring out how often to evaluate what is going on and maybe readjust the course of action. The other approach is that you also need to have a way to fail quickly, fail fast, fail forward. And by that, I mean lessons learned that immediately you're sharing with your team and almost in real time. Most of the Agile, if you have any Agile methodologies being used within NIH today, or within some of the tasks that are part of the CIO office, maybe it's about figuring out, how to quickly put something out there that starts being like a, going from an evolved prototype or concept to something that is maybe more of a hands-on, and then over time it becomes more and more complete solution. And sometimes you need to have, set the expectations for everybody. The users, because they realize that it's not going to be doing all the things they wanted to do from the very beginning, and you need to figure out who are the right beta users to recruit very early on. And realize that sometimes things will work, sometimes they won't work, and what you really need is to have that feedback mechanism that allows the users to give you feedback and allow the team to figure out very quickly, how do you start maybe changing what you're doing? Evaluating, readjusting is what you're doing here based on feedback from real users or even customers. Number 4, improve the team performance. And improving team performance is really about several different things. Number 1, it's about implementing the right metrics. I've been in environments where I go in and just saying, we don't understand why we can't, get better at this. And when I start really assessing exactly what they're measuring, how they're measuring, guess what I find most of the time? They're measuring the wrong things, right? And it's all because some of those metrics are part of the culture. This is the way we've always measured our progress across every project. And what I find is that usually those organizations are the ones that are failing to adjust to changing customer expectations, changing sponsor expectations, and now they need to figure out how to implement different metrics and measure different things in the way they're tracking progress. Because progress is, whatever you used to think was the scope of a project, now the stakeholders are looking at it from a different point of view. And now the customers or the end users are looking at it from even a different perspective. And those are the things that you need to start measuring, because very early on, it's now about keeping your users, your customers happy, because they have the leverage. If you're not providing the right information to them at the right time, they're going to go somewhere else very quickly. And this happens especially when it comes to analytics that you're providing to them. If you're not giving them the right rendition or the right visualization of whatever they're tracking, they're going to find something else that they're going to use instead, even when you have a standardized analytic solution that you're trying to deploy across the entire organization. Benchmarking. Benchmarking comes in different things. It's not just internal to between one project to another when they're all part of the same portfolio. It's about benchmarking your performance against your competitors. And realize that there may be some out there that are not necessarily competitors. They're maybe like frenemies from an organizational point of view. Who are those when it comes to the institutes that are part of NIH? Or who are those stakeholders that are basically going somewhere else because they're actually now looking for a more localized picture, but relying on a globalized approach as to how they're collecting things, especially when it comes to long-term studies. So benchmarking, you have to have that balanced approach of what are the things that you're going to keep track of that are about your projects, the things that you can control, and what are the things that you want to keep track of your competition or your peers that are somewhere else. And making sure that at least you're looking at how the value you're delivering to your stakeholders compared to the value your competitors are delivering to the same stakeholders. And so benchmarking takes a lot of work, and actually also is part of additional metrics that you need to implement into your projects that are not just about looking at isolated projects standalone. You got to look at the more interconnection, interdependence of projects, and the way that most users or most customers or sponsors are actually viewing the information when they're collecting it from different sources, not just your own. And part of this is that it's about really looking at figuring out how to improve basic things that are about part of the organization structure, the departments, the way that projects are broken down, the way tasks are broken down into projects, the tools that you're providing to your workers to track everything, and then make sure that it's consistent across all your projects. And just like there is optimization in the way you do things with people and their knowledge, it should also be about figuring out how to vet new next generation tools that were not there 3-5 years ago and figuring out whether there's value in adopting them because they may be worthwhile. And a lot of this information is right now where a lot of the transformation is going on even within healthcare. What is everybody doing right now in healthcare when they're saying everybody has to transform? Well, how do they transform, and how do they begin figuring out how to transform themselves? It starts with someone feeding them analytics about their industry, their market, their customers, to figure out how they can improve the business models that they have today. And this is happening right now. CVS acquiring Aetna. Now a pharmacy is going to be also a health plan provider. Amazon teaming up with JP Morgan and Berkshire Hathaway to provide their own health insurance plans to all the employers of all three companies. And together, those three companies have 1 million workers around the world. And now they're developing their own health plan. This is a brand new player that no one even foresaw. How are the incumbents going to deal with that? It's not about doing more projects or doing more, it's figuring out how to work differently. This is where it starts. Measuring, tracking, and being able to figure out all those things where are gaps that you never thought you needed to fill. And now the expectation from the customers is somebody needs to fill those. What are you going to do? What is your role? And how are you going to ensure that you continue adding value to those stakeholders in the process? Number 5, understand business strategy. And understanding the business strategy is about understanding not just your business model, but your stakeholders, not just your suppliers and your supply chain and partners, your collaborators, understanding everybody who's part of your team, even if the team is virtual or geographically dispersed around the world, in addition to channels, distribution channels that you need to reach the end user or adopter of whatever it is that you're providing in the market. That really is the business strategy. And what I find is that most project managers are too focused, just so busy running projects, that they have no clue what a business model is, number 1. No clue as to what value they're delivering to the end adopters who are far removed because they're not in the building, they're out there in the world, right? And they're not even collecting any feedback from those stakeholders and no way to get those reports. So they don't even understand what value is in the perspective of the end adopters of whatever they're putting out, whether it's reports, whether it's dashboards that people are putting on a portal. All those things you need to figure out, have clarity as to what is the value of what the information that you're putting there. And how are those customers using that information that you're delivering to them? That should give you clarity as to how do you start adding more value over time. And expect that in today's world, this is going to take a lot of work. Why? Because customer behavior is changing. And it's changing faster than ever. Not slowing down, it's actually accelerating. More and more of us are expecting that on our mobile devices, we get to the right thing at the right time and no, without necessarily having to wait for it, because we're impatient now. And we're used to that. This is the standards that Amazon has already, given us. Facebook, Google, Microsoft. They're all doing this and working hard at doing this because they're actually doing market research to get that information. So understanding customers is key, and this is not static. There's actually entire teams dedicated to do this within organizations where they're actually monetizing from those customers, because those are buyers. Microsoft spends a lot of time just doing market research on how enterprise users are using their Office 365 suite today. And they successfully have gone from client-based Office suite to Office suite as a service, that now all of us are now just turning on our machines, and that has actually, something that Microsoft has done. They actually have gone from before the current CEO and before, when Bill Gates their average growth rate per year was 4%. Under Satya, the new CEO, who's been now CEO for over 10 years, that growth rate has exploded to 12% a year. For a company that is a multi-billion-dollar organization, that doesn't come by just accident. It comes from doing this right, understanding their customers and their sense of value, and then figuring out how to implement a new revenue stream that never existed before off of the same product that they've had for a long time. And successfully transforming their entire business to be able to grow the business. Not do the same thing that BlackBerry Research in Motion did, or the same thing that Kodak did. Because these are all multi-billion-dollar companies that existed before, no longer around because they never took the time to do this right. And this is not just found. It takes a lot of work to figure out how to do this right. Get your customers to continue not only buying what they've been buying, but buying more and increase the size of order. Both. At the same time that you're capturing new customers that haven't bought from you before, even though you've been around for decades. A lot of companies are failing to do this right, and this is why I'm stressing. Last year alone, 50 retailers went out of business. And these were not like companies that were startups. These were companies that were just around for a long time. What happened is just this last month, Toys R Us went out of business. This is the way of the future. Companies that don't do this, they will be out in the next 5 years. Because everybody's projecting that figuring out how to get new customer segments to buy and continue to buy from you require you as an organization to develop new revenue streams that you haven't had before if you want to remain viable as an organization. What does it mean even if you're an NGO? Don't know, but disruption is coming. Keep grace under pressure. Any project, especially when it's something that may be a high-risk project, which is not necessarily bad because actually risk can be good, right? Good risk means what? That if you spend a little bit of time now, a little bit of resources today, you're going to have a large payoff pretty quickly down the road, right? Sometimes you need to take those risks, and you need to make sure that across your entire portfolio of projects, you have a range from low to medium to high risk, and then you staff them accordingly. Expect that the people that are going to be responsible for your high-risk projects, they're the right leaders that can basically figure out how to keep grace under pressure. Why is that? Because sometimes you might not have, you may be under-resourced, understaffed, not even have ambiguity in your scope, and then you just say, here, just do it. And this is where you start really learning, right? This is where the fail forward really starts, because you expect those high-risk teams to have a high failure rate. Well, make sure your leaders understand that, because it's impossible to just be driving your people, expecting the results that are just impossible. Now, if you have a way to start escalating, because now you start saying, well, it's a high risk, but it's also a high value project that now it's critical. You start figuring out how to start allocating resources from other projects once that project is in the red to try to get it back in the green. And that balance is what you need to start looking at. You can have the right people in the team that don't mind saying, look, stop what you're doing. Now you need to start helping this other team instead. And then we'll get you back on track once we're back in the green on that project. Understand that there's a balance of resources, and it really is about resource allocation, and make sure that you have the right people who are flexible enough, adaptable enough, that they can actually start looking at, those kinds of situations when sometimes they need to stop what they're doing in their current project and then shift over to a different project because the other project needs to get brought back within the scope or within the schedule or within the context of whatever its placement is. Number 7, know when to adapt. If you start with your plan A, plan B, and those don't work, well, guess what? There's always 26 other letters in the alphabet that you can start working. Make sure you have those backup plans ready to go, ready to know exactly when you need to start implementing them, and then start communicating to your team why you're shifting from the current plan that you're on, and now you're adjusting to a different plan instead. Expect things to go wrong. That's part of project management. And that sometimes it really becomes a lot easier to do that shift when you already have a learning process in place. If you're already having your best practices that you're going to have some higher risk projects that you don't expect to have 100% be on target, right? You may be out of the three constraints of being on scope, on budget, on time, you're only going to get maybe one of the three, or maybe halfway there across all three. Realize that sometimes that's the way you need to start putting your project together, and make sure that everyone in the team has that expectation that you're going to get as far as you can for as long as you can until you figure out a different approach based on what you learned, based on what just happened, and continuously asking the question, why are we doing this? And what are the things that are working? What are the things that are not working? What are the things that we need to stop? And continuously be able to adjust that as you're even working on that particular project. It takes that type of team meetings with your members, and sometimes they're part of your daily scrum. Sometimes they're part of your weekly iterations, and it's an ongoing process by which you're collecting this information from the team based on feedback from real users. Number 8, building competence. Sometimes I mentioned it's critical that not only are you increasing your own skills, your own knowledge, but make sure that at least you're building the team's knowledge as well. Because just building your own knowledge can only get you so far. You're much better off making sure that not only are you gaining knowledge, but that the rest of your team is also figuring out how to gain that knowledge when you know that there's value in them doing so. So leaders really focus on not just adding value to themselves by learning more and pushing themselves more every day and learning new things, but also ensuring that as project leaders, they actually have ownership as to, which members are they going to help grow in the right direction. And that comes through the approach of instilling, personally, adding more knowledge as new things come up, to actually providing coaching, mentoring, guidance to team members. And having those kinds of exchanges like this lunch and learn that you have, that is an ongoing part of the organization by which you're exchanging and sharing that knowledge among the team. And what I often find is that I'm building knowledge for me, sharing it immediately, even with people who don't have, maybe close to where I'm at in knowledge of that same subject matter expertise, or even people who have no knowledge of that. It's actually a way that it helps me retain more, practice it, and be able to start figuring out how to use it effectively within what I'm doing in my projects. And as a matter of fact, this is what I do on an ongoing basis. As I'm building new knowledge, I immediately look for opportunities to share that knowledge with the right people, because it helps me memorize, retain, figure out how to use it right, at the same time that I'm actually enabling others to figure out the same things. Number 9, encourage collaboration. Now, collaboration is where you start looking at, really having an effective relay team. Realizing that it's not a race of individuals, it's a collective race, right? Where, everyone is responsible for getting, their part done, because that part is only critical for a specific segment along the way to project success. So it really is about figuring out when you're done with your task, who do you have to hand off to? And what is the way they prefer that handoff to be made? Because that changes by the stakeholder, right? And you got to understand what drives the other person. What is, are they left-handed, right-handed? Are they right? Which part of their brain are they mostly in? Are they have IQ or high EQ, or maybe they're somewhere in the middle across both? You need to understand all those things, because those things matter when it comes to really, truly collaborating as a team. And understanding those things, a leader figures out very quickly, not only do you have a group of people that are working together, to have a real team that works collaboratively, you need a group of people who can trust each other. And trust is a process. It's not something that you just give overnight to people when you first meet them. As a matter of fact, none of us do, right? It's a process by which we have to get to know each other, get to know our styles, and get to know what we prefer, what we don't like, and realize that sometimes those things, sometimes matter. It's those small things that, as to the way you hand off something, that makes the difference between whether that person is going to be inspired, motivated to take it as fast as they can to the next person, or not. And that's about keeping your team engaged. So fostering teamwork is part of that leadership. Figuring out what are those things that that are about the styles, individual styles of your team members, and figuring out very quickly, who are the right people that should be working together, and which are the ones that need to be maybe sort of like prepared to deal with certain types of people. It's all part of just getting to know each other when you're part of the same team. And sometimes realize that, especially in those medium risk or higher projects, you may have a title and you may have a role, but the task itself is going to be ambiguous. Expect that. And so what that really means is that the relay race, you don't really know if it's going to be, it looks like it's going to be like a mile. It looks like it's going to be maybe 5 people that need to figure out how to get there. Then you quickly realize that not everybody is going to be the same length of time involved or contributing the same. Just expect it. And maybe assign them other types of things, like maybe doing some sharing of other knowledge that may be about building for the next segment of the race. And preparing for, dealing with situations that are unforeseen. These are all intangibles that you need to figure out how to do when you have a lot of task ambiguity and that you have roles, but those roles, they're not necessarily all going to be contributing the same. And that's reality. Sometimes you have people with more experience, more expertise, or a broader set of subject matter expertise, and those may take a major part in the role compared to others that you're just basically saying, we need you to be more operational or more concerned about the how, not necessarily the next thing about figuring out how to anticipate the next turn or the next approach to where you need to go. So those are the 9 things that we talked about. So in summary, and to summarize, number 1, you got to start with a purpose and make sure your team understands that single purpose as to why you're involved in this particular project and for how long. Keep the teams engaged by ensuring that you understand their different styles. Identify immediately, part of at the very front end of your project, identify barriers, obstacles, anything that will happen, because Murphy's Law is here, right? Murphy is around, and it always happens across projects. You need to be prepared to at least figure out what are the most likely things that are going to be happening. Figure out how to improve team performance over time. Start with measuring, and start looking at to get better and better, not only for your team, but start benchmarking across other internal teams and benchmark against competitors. Figure out how to improve your team performance. Figure out how to understand your business model and how it needs to evolve based on changing customer behavior. Ensure your team stays together even through hard times, because hard times will happen. Expect that. Has nothing to do with the fact that you're the project manager. Has to do with that's reality. figure out how to deal with those kinds of things, and make sure you have a risk management team in place, a response plan in place to make sure that whenever a fire drill happens, you're ready to go. Your team is ready to go, and they understand exactly, who's going to be guiding people or, aiding people when they need to be assisted in case of emergency. So with that, I'd like to sort of open up this for questions. And for those of you who are remote, you can either unmute yourself. I don't know if we have a way to put can they type in questions? Okay. So I would say that remainder of the time, I would say if you have any questions, or even the audience here, welcome for any questions. And before I get started, I wanted to mention I'm actually doing this particular career conference for women. It's the 4th annual one, and we're going to be doing one on supercharging or creating or improving your personal brand. That's coming up. It's a free conference to attend, and this particular workshop will be from 4 to 5 p.m. on Saturday the 21st. More information is available on the URL at the bottom of the slide, and this entire slide deck is already posted. Will be shared with everyone post-event. So if anybody's interested, sign up. It's free to attend, and I'll be there. We're also doing coaching assessments of personal brands. If you're interested, more information here. If you need to grab your books, as I mentioned earlier, if you check in on the landing page, you will get information as to how you can download these 2 resources immediately, and also get the landing page where this entire slide deck is already posted. So you can share this and you can review this on your own time if you need to. And more information about me, you can either email me, connect with me on LinkedIn, go to my website, and you can also set up a free appointment if you're in need. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question regarding just the bigger picture. So I think everyone that came to this meeting and is interested in this topic is on board with, learning, self-improvement, fostering collaboration. How do you share those values with people that maybe wouldn't seek a meeting like this out and are on your team and are just more resistant to collaboration and are more resistant to communication and are natural introverts?
So that's a great question. And actually, I would say that this is those different styles. And so what I do, I can tell you the style that I do, right? I realize that most people that are in project management, there's always going to be some sort of fire drill that comes up. So even if you have the best intention that you have a regular lunch and learn where everybody's, working hard at setting up a topic and a great speaker to come in and talk about that they're just going to be gone because something happened and now they need to go and figure out, how to deal with what's going on in their project. Well, what I do is I actually realize that I capture this information. It's not just a live delivery. Off of this live delivery, I'm creating three separate products. The slide deck by itself, shared with everybody who's not necessarily going to be paying 100% attention because they're going to be busy answering emails, especially if they're remote, in between my talk, right? I'm also then creating a podcast because there's some people that learn by listening. Others are more visual and they learn by viewing or watching the video. These are all different products that come up from every talk that I do. And I've worked hard to establish my partners to be able to produce as quickly as possible this information because I realize that all of us have a different style as to the way we learn. And sometimes I'm the one that, if somebody reads to me, right, it just goes in one ear and out the other. Listening to me is the hardest part for me. And I realize that's my weakness. I'm a very visual person, right? The way that I memorize, I need to see something. And I can maybe see the image, and now I can start engaging. But to really make it practical for me, I need to start actually viewing it and then writing it. And that's my learning style. And so what that means is that I can't deal with interruptions. If somebody says, I'm busy doing something as I'm trying to really focus on this, and somebody comes in and says, hey, I have a question for, can you help me with this? If I'm busy doing that, it really disrupts my learning process, right? some people are like that, whether they're introverts or extroverts, it doesn't really matter. Our learning styles are different, and sometimes some of us learn by listening to people. Other of us want to see it before we practice it, and others learn by doing. You need to figure out what are the styles within your team, and then figure out if this is the way they want to learn, make it available to them, right? So for me, it's make sure that at least I make available my slides, the video, and a podcast of the same content. Because I realize that sometimes not everybody's going to be paying attention 100%, and their retention for most, on the average, of any live delivery is going to be very, very small. So typically, I just provide information because there's a lot of information that I'm packing that I realize the retention rate is going to vary widely across anybody who's listening or viewing the information. So part of this is basically learning, what is that style of their team, that's the way they like to learn, or the way they like to work. Because sometimes even that, figuring out what is the next line of code that you're going to do. If you're an introvert, you don't want any interruptions. You want to figure out, hey, I want to do not just this one thing, but I want to do this, and this in one line of code. And that takes a lot of thought. If you're an introvert, you want to spend time and maybe even have like A/B testing of your code to make sure that it's, which one has better performance. So I hope that answers your question, but I think it has to do with the style.
I think it's a
the
good
style, especially if you're doing coding, you expect a lot of the people who are introverts, they don't want interruptions as they're starting to code. As a matter of fact, somebody coming in and just knocking on their door, or, if you're in an open environment, somebody just popping in and say, hey, you want to go to lunch right now, you kind of have to give them a heads up. Sometimes it's better off where you say, some people you're better just saying, hey, a quick chat that they can do whenever they're ready, and then they reply to you, right? These are all communication styles that are different. But now there's more sophisticated tools that allow you to engage them the way they like to be engaged. Most people now, they like being texted instead of somebody interrupting you in the middle of something, right? Because they know that they can deal with a text whenever they're ready. They're not prepared for you to break their thinking process when you're trying to approach them.
Are there any other questions? I have a comment because of the time. You open up with a very interesting quote from Peter Drucker about the value of management versus leadership. And as project managers, we're always giving the impression, I believe, that you're either one or the other. But as your presentation brought out, sometimes you have to incorporate both the management and the leadership skills to have a productive career and working environment.
That's correct. I think right now, project management, more so than ever before, where traditionally the role of project management has been assigned to really take control of the quality of your deliverables, right? And those are the three things that traditionally were all project management. It's now shifted because now it's all about the value that you're delivering to your stakeholders. And your stakeholders can be customers, they can be users, they can be a combination of both. You need to understand what is value to them, because the only reason why they're going to continue coming back to use whatever it is that you're working hard to deliver to them is to ensure that you understand their perspective as to what are the things they really like about that you need to continue doing more of in whatever you're doing in your deliverables. What are the things that they don't like and you need to stop? And what are the things that you need to improve because in their point of view, there's deficiencies, right? And if you just talk to your team that's working on it, you're not going to get that perspective from your team. You need to go out and seek that information, and that means interviewing, going outside of your building and talking to the actual users, and then bringing that information back and sharing it with your team. Project management is now shifting, I really believe, from just looking at quality alone to really understanding what value are you delivering and to whom, and how do you continue to maximize that value, because that's the only way you're going to continue to keep loyalty of your users, of your customers, by increasing the value over time of whatever you're delivering.
Well, thank you so much, Hector. I do believe the entire community enjoyed this conversation, and we will take the tidbits we've learned and apply them to our jobs to be more effective project managers.